I'll go back to being very pious in a minute. I've always been a sports fan. I have not yet been cured of that particular passion of mine. And in the football world, it became famous in the name of, I think, both Bill Belichick, do your job. If you should have been working and instead you are davening or learning or doing some other mitzvah, you're not getting like a pat on the back from Yisrael Salanter or Rav Wolbe. You're wrong. That's, in a certain sense, a mitzvah b'avera, as he called it. Do your job. I was in my late 40s before I made this switch, and I never had to learn, let's say, to take one example, like the skill of time management. And I think all of us, and I'm certainly as guilty of this as anybody, right? We set our, expectations often way lower. We think we're capable of much less than we're really capable of.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank. Shtark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Bnei Torah in the workforce. There's really one main book if you want to go to find Torah sources about being a Bnei Torah in the workforce, and that is Rav Aaron Lopiansky's wonderful sefer, A Bnei Torah for Life, which we've discussed in the podcast, also with Rav Lopiansky and with others as well. But I recently came across a short little chapter which was full of tremendous gems directly related to this topic. It's part of the sefer Alei Shur. I discovered it by listening to a shiur by Rav Dovid Gottlieb based on this chapter, and I am thrilled to be joined by Rav Gottlieb to discuss these ideas. So Rav Gottlieb, welcome to Shtark Tank, and thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Pleasure to be here.
So just by way of background, can you tell us a little bit about the Alei Shur and why you have been teaching his Torah in your community, and then we'll get into the actual ideas that he discusses geared directly towards Bnei Torah in the workforce.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, my pleasure. I don't know so much about the history of the book, in part because it was published a little bit in a mysterious way. It's published anonymously. You'll never see Rav Wolbe, Shlomo Wolbe, the author of the sefer, 2 volumes. You'll never see his name anywhere. If I remember correctly, I think it was published in the 60s, maybe 1966. And I think it was a little bit of a phenomenon from the moment it was published. And I think the reason for that is that he takes a lot of the timeless Musar ideas. Not only does he present them in general in a captivating way, but he specifically presents them in a way that is very realistic and relevant in the contemporary world. And even, a few decades ago in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, I still feel it to be incredibly relevant. A few years ago, I was looking specifically for a sefer that would be inspiring for my congregants in my shul in Ramat Beit Shemesh. And we settled on a Friday morning shiur, which I've been now giving. I think this is the 5th year that we're giving the shiur in the book Alei Shur. I have to say, it does not disappoint. It's true, as you said, that it's this particular chapter that relates to our topic of being a Bnei Torah in the workforce. That's not the book in general is about religious life from many, many different perspectives and dimensions. And virtually without any exception, I feel like every chapter has something that's insightful and relevant. So it's really an incredible sefer. And like you, I agree, this particular chapter is really a winner and very, very powerful.
So getting into the chapter, he really is giving straight up hadracha for a Bnei Torah who was in yeshiva, is going to work. And it's interesting just to see where he starts the conversation. He starts it with the Midrash about Chanuch. Now, some of us may be familiar with this Midrash, some of us may not. Maybe we can review that Midrash and why it's significant to this topic that we're talking about today.
So it's an incredible Midrash from an obscure collection of the Midrashim that basically describes Chanuch working, I think, as a cobbler. I think, he's sewing shoes or something like that. And the Midrash has a line, if I remember correctly, about how in every stitch, every tefira, he would express what I think the Midrash calls yechidot. Now, I think the way I would have translated that on my own would have been something Kabbalistic or mystical, maybe Shem Hashem in some mystical way. But Rav Wolbe quotes the comment of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in which he says that no, what actually was referring to is that each and every stitch, Chanuch would basically be declaring and verbalizing how he wants to do a good job. The first and most important yechidah, that focus, that intentionality that he's bringing to his work is that he wants to do a good job. He then adds that why he wants to do a good job is that he wants to benefit other people and help, make a better world and help people who will then wear these clothing, wear these shoes. And I think that you're right. It's a striking medrash, and even more importantly, it's a striking interpretation by Rav Salanter that is endorsed by Rav Wolbe, because I think it speaks not only to the specifics of the medrash, but that broader point, even the broader religious point, that we instinctively associate religiosity with something mystical or very far off. And Rabbi Salanter, in a very characteristic insight, is very much grounding it in something very real world, very relevant, and also very much interpersonal. That if you bring the right intentionality, if you have the right kavanah, the right intention when you're doing something, even as mundane as, crafting a shoe, that elevates that action to something that could be described by the Midrash with the same terminology that the Midrash itself would use to describe something actually Kabbalistic and uttering God's name. It's a godly act to be able to be a tailor, to be a cobbler, to be a shoemaker, when your whole purpose is, I want to make the world a better place. I want to help people. I want to do a good job so that whoever ends up wearing and buying these shoes will have a walk to shul or a comfortable walk to work or just be able to be protected from the elements, etc. That itself is this yichidot, so to speak. This is a divine or godly act. And I think that is an incredibly powerful insight.
And on that sort of meta point, which you said, this tension that I think a lot of us see in many different areas as Jews, as Avdei Hashem, between viewing aspirations of these very, very lofty, intense, godly ideas versus taking them in their most simple and accessible and practical interpretation. Sometimes it can feel, on the one hand, it's tempting to feel that we need the lofty experiences. On the other hand, it's invigorating to see that maybe we could actually just find the most important meaning in the things that are right in front of our nose. So could you talk to that point a little more broadly as to how we approach our day-to-day lives and appreciating the little things in our avodas Hashem that are not so complicated and up in heaven?
Yeah, I think you're bringing out a great point. And Rav Wolbe, we shouldn't be surprised, and it's going to come up later in the essay, and I imagine, therefore, you'll want to bring it up later in the conversation. He does not go to such an extreme and say, well, because of the meaning that you can bring to your professional life, therefore you don't need the other stuff, right? Rav Wolbe, in the last part of the essay, maintains high standards, even in classical limud haTorah, for the professional. But nevertheless, yes, what he's introducing to us is, I think, something very, very powerful, that the intention that we bring to something can transform its value. Now, he's not talking about, obviously, something that's prohibited, it's illicit and immoral and unethical. But much of the world and much of the things that we do in our day-to-day lives, including in our professional life, is objectively parv. Again, there are red lines that in different professions people could cross, but he doesn't even bring that up in the essay because that's self-evidently inappropriate. But parv things, just being let's translate this to modern terminology, just being an engineer, just being a computer programmer, and let's assume for now the project you're working on is not something that has an obvious or innate spiritual benefit. So a person could look at that and think, okay, that's totally divorced from my religious life. On the other hand, you can bring layers of meaning. And in the continuation of the essay, he's going to discuss the idea of honesty in business, etc. So let's not even get to that yet, because for him, that's a secondary point. Here, I think, and that's perhaps the thing that I think perhaps some people and maybe even some Sfarim will naturally go to, well, yeah, it's true, what you're doing may not be innately meaningful, but if you do it honestly, then that's a good thing. Now, Rav Wolbe is going to be very into the honesty and how your money is, but he's actually saying something much more profound here. And if I remember correctly, I believe he even uses the term, I called it parv, but he says there is no such thing in the world that is chiloni, right? Because the truth, what he means is innately. There's nothing that's secular or completely vacuous of spiritual meaning innately. Anything, if you bring the right intentionality and kavanah to it, can be transformed profoundly and literally into a godly act. That's why the Midrash refers to these yichidot, not referring to Kabbalistic, incantations, but every stitch. It's a godly, divine act because you bring the intentionality. And what is that intentionality? I want to help other people. I want to contribute to the world, etc. And I think that transforms. Again, it does not mean, therefore, you never have to learn. It doesn't mean you don't have to be honest in the business, in the accounting. No, those are all true. But those are almost downstream. Like you said, it's striking, but therefore telling that this is the piece that the part that he specifically starts with. Because this is the piece in which he is completely focused on as an innate value that you can bring to every one of your actions.
So just taking that idea and taking it to a more practical place, you have been a Rav Kehila, you have Talmidim, and you have alumni from your yeshivas that you've taught in, etc. So there is a broad global challenge with regards to meaning at work. And one of the ways to think about that challenge is, in the olden days, everyone was in B2C. Everyone was providing shoes for their neighbors, baking bread for their community, doing things, providing services for real people that they could actually see and see the impact that they're having on people's lives. But in today's corporate world, the B2B world, with these big corporations where people feel that they're very small cogs in these very big enterprises that are not really doing anything for actual people on the ground. So that creates a crisis in meaning at work. So that's something you've seen your balabatim and your students deal with. And how do we apply this idea? Is there a way to apply this idea in today's current reality, specifically in the sort of B2B world?
So I have to confess that I think this level of this type of question, which is more granular in terms of the nuances of the professional world, I think me as a rabbi, I'm a little bit at a loss. I don't identify as much with that distinction. I understand the words you're using, and I can't contradict or deny a reality you say exists, which is that people in that B2B world may feel more adrift and more disconnected from that. I can't really comment on that as a reality you're describing. What I can say is I think that nothing that you describe fundamentally alters the Alei Shur's calculation. In other words, at the end of the day, assuming that the B that you're working for is providing a service to the B that is your client, and that they are doing something that will eventually be helpful and productive in society. So it's true, you're more removed, and like in any game of telephone, it's harder to feel and see the impact of what you're doing. And I think, but that is not an inherent or fundamental problem as much as it is a pragmatic one. But I don't see why that should be the case. Now, again, I don't know if this is where we want the conversation to go, and it doesn't come up at all in his essay, so I'm guessing we don't. But could there be professions, could there even be hypothetically industries which are not ideal to go into? Are there modern variations of what, Chazal referred to as a melach and a nikia, or some form of that? Yeah, I imagine there could be. I don't think necessarily it's because it's B2B, but there could be categories, I think for sure, of professions that are more and less meaningful. I don't think there's any reason to deny that. And I would say one final word on this, which is that I think a lot of it might be subjective. Meaning if a person, him or herself, feels that either because my company is so big, or my role within the company, or the nature of the industry I'm in is too far removed from people, as it were, and therefore you don't feel any meaning, so then it doesn't matter what Rav Wolbe thinks, or let alone what Dovid Gottlieb thinks. It might not be the best profession for you.
Right.
But if you ask me on a more fundamental level, I don't see why there should be that distinction.
Okay, fair enough. So let's just move on in the essay, because he segues very interestingly from this idea of Chanuch, and he goes into the question really of like work-life balance, specifically with regards to like religious obligations and our roles as husbands and fathers and taking care of our family, but also being dedicated to our Torah and our tefillah. And I just wanted to maybe quote one phrase from this segue here. He says, "In a place where there's good midos and kindness and love, everything that is done is exalted to become real, actual avodas Hashem," which I found a striking phrase. And I'm wondering, is that something that we educate for enough? In yeshiva, the goal is to be the biggest lamdan and to finish shas. And there obviously is talk about Muslims, talk about midos, but I'm wondering if this outlook, which connects the midos a person has at work, the midos person has at home, and their sort of core identity as a Bnei Torah, is that something that maybe we don't emphasize enough or don't apply enough? Happy to hear your thoughts about that.
Again, I think you're opening up a huge topic, which if we would go down that rabbit hole would take us we'd never get back to the rest of the essay. But I do think it's a very fair and significant point. I feel like the religious value if I understood your question correctly, the religious value in Midos Tovos and such, I think is not emphasized enough. It is true that there is something in our hard wiring that even if intellectually we know, and we've heard from our rabbi and our rebbeim, there are two halves to the luchos, and not everyone believes it. But even the people who believe it, and that may sound shocking to people, but I am convinced that not everyone believes that. But even those who believe it, I think it's fair to say that we're hardwired in a way that we don't experience these two phenomena in the same way. Here I'm drawing on, again, this is not part of the this particular piece in Rav Wolbe and in Alei Shur, and it's not something that I even thought might come up in the conversation, but I'm drawing on essays that I read many, many years ago by a professor of education, Dr. Aaron Hirsch Fried. And he did a lot of important work, I think, in this field. And he pointed out what I think you're getting at, and I'm trying to tease out even more, is that experientially, what he referred to as the frum high. So we don't get that frum high in the same level as, for example, having, let alone even expressing Midos Tovos, that we do from the great Ne'ilah, or from a good Shmon Esrei, or from learning a good Daf Gemara, even if we could cite chapter and verse by the Chesed, the Ben L'Chavero, the Midos is just as important. We don't experience it the same way. There's something in our hard wiring that thinks that it's good, but not necessarily religious. Religiosity we associate with certain types of behaviors, and I think that is a huge nisayon. And Dr. Fried was, doing some research and trying to figure out how to, once you identify the problem, then what can we do about it? But that is a huge topic, but I agree with your diagnosis for sure. I'd be happy to come on if you wanted me to discuss just Rabbi Fried's essay, Dr. Fried's essay. It's amazing.
All right, so it is fascinating, and I would just say, I don't know if you're referring to this exact work, but I do remember being very clearly in my sort of intense Shana Bet stage and hearing the vort about the fact that, if there were, the luchos were the same size and there were much fewer letters on the Ben Adam L'Chavero side, they must have been much bigger, which shows they're much more important. And I heard that as a Shana Bet, intense guy, and I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So it was certainly
I'm not sure
attention.
it's the best vort either, to be honest. But the broader point that there are, two halves of the luchos and, numerous other sources that confirm, the importance of Ben Adam L'Chavero, et cetera. It's, that's undeniable. And yet, live their lives with a certain, I'm not even sure what the right word is, but like I said, what I said before, we're just hardwired not to feel it that way.
Right. So then, as I mentioned before, alluded to before, he transitions to a topic which is actually, in general, a lot more common ground between the rabbinic and educators and Klei Kodesh, some of whom listen to this show, some of whom haven't. We actually discussed on a recent episode the question of minyan and davening and family and kids. So take us into how Rav Wolbe attacks this challenge, which many of us face, especially younger ones, but also older ones, as far as the balance and the struggle that sometimes comes between these two parts of our life.
So this, I love every bit of this essay, but this might be my favorite part of the essay, and it's a story. He tells a story in the name of Rav Yisrael Salanter, how one year he was on his way to Kol Nidrei, and he never showed up to shul. Could you imagine? The Gadol Ador, the rabbi, Yisrael Salanter is not at shul Kol Nidrei night. And eventually they discovered that he had been on his way to shul, and he noticed that there was a home in which there was a baby left who was crying, and there was no one attending to that baby, because not only the father, but the mother as well had gone to shul. They both wanted to be in shul for Kol Nidrei. And Rav Wolbe decided, well, somebody has to be with the baby. If the mom's and the father are going to abandon the child, then I have to stay with the baby. Very, very powerful story just in terms of the behavior of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. But again, I don't remember offhand how much of this is attributed to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter himself articulating the Musar and how much was Rav Wolbe's clear understanding of the story. But I don't know if it matters, because I think the Musar of Rav Yisrael Salanter is self-evident, and it's what Rav Wolbe describes. Either it's literally the words of Yisrael Salanter, or it's indisputably what he was trying to convey, and that is the fundamental flaw that was a mistake that was made here. Now, not to get sidetracked, but the clear implicit purpose of this story, or the clear implicit assumption, I should say, of this story, was a more traditionalist gender assumption, which is that the mother should have stayed home. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole. Well, maybe the mother should have gone to shul and the father should stay home. Right? I don't think that's the topic of your podcast in general, Shtark Tank, and it's certainly not the topic you brought me on to discuss. So let's just let's stipulate that the mother was the one who should have been home, and then she chose to leave. And Rav Wolbe makes the point, without getting into the role of mothers versus fathers, he doesn't get to that at all. But that just uvda, as we would say in modern Hebrew. The fact is, the mother's job was to be home. And he basically says straight out, that's what Hashkacha wanted. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you the gift. He gave you a child. If you had no children, you weren't married, or you were childless, then, yeah, of course, come to shul. But if Hashem gives you a little baby, then the place where Hashem has put you, where Hashkacha wants you to do, your primary role now is to be that mother and to be with that child. And this, was reminiscent, I'll go back to being very pious in a minute, but if I could be a little bit more broad and acknowledge my broader knowledge, I've always been a sports fan. I have not yet been cured of that particular passion of mine. And in the football world, it became famous in the name of, I think, both Bill Belichick and one of his disciples, Coach Saban, where they had this line, do your job. Football teams are very complex with lots of different moving parts. And the way to be successful is for each person to just have a very specific understanding of what their job is and then do your job. And, getting back to being pious now, that's what Salanter and Rav Wolbe are trying to tell us. We have a tafkid. Hashgacha has placed us in a certain, it's because we're married. It's because we have children. It's because we're a doctor, a lawyer, a soldier, whatever it is that we're doing. Right now, that's your job. Avodas Hashem tells us, do your job, as we saw previously, best as you can, every stitch. Do a good job. Not only do your job well, do it with the right purpose and provide meaningful intentionality. I'm not just doing it because I enjoy it. I'm not just doing it because it'll bring me kavod. I'm not just doing it because it'll bring me affluence. I'm doing this because I want to contribute to the yeshivo shel olam, or maybe depending on what your job is, specifically to help the Jewish people, whatever the job is. But even if it's as broad as to help the world, clearly he sees that as something very positive and meaningful. That's your job. And avodas Hashem says, do that when you're supposed to be doing that, as well as possible with the highest degree of intentionality and meaning that you can infuse, as we discussed previously. That's your job. If when you're supposed to be doing that, you choose to learn or you choose to daven, that's not avodas Hashem. That's turning the davening or the learning or whatever the other mitzvah you're doing in, you basically turn that into an avodah zarah. Now, those are my words, not his, but that's what he's trying to say. You've created that as an end in of itself, not realizing that the goal is not Torah. The goal is not the mitzvah. The goal is not even called Nidrei. The goal is Ratzon Hashem. What does Hashem want from us? And it could be, and you alluded to Rav Lopiansky at the outset, so one of the big theses and insights of his book is that at different stages of life, what Hashem wants from you might be different. So at this stage of your life, because you're the mother in the story, or this stage of your life because you are a professional with responsibilities, both to your family you have to support and to the company that you are employed by, etc., your job for those hours a day or those hours a week is to do the job as honestly as possible, as well as possible, with as much intentionality and meaning as possible. If you would betray that in the name of quote-unquote frumkeit, a word that Rav Wolbe very much does not like, the whole chapter in which he goes against that word frumkeit. So if you do that, you've turned what should be a means to an end into the end in of itself. That's what I meant when I calling it an avodah zarah. Ratzon Hashem, yes, typically we would think Ratzon Hashem is I should learn. Yeah, but not if you're on the clock and supposed to be doing something else. Ratzon Hashem is to be in shul for Kol Nidrei, isn't it? Maybe not. Maybe for most people, but not for a young mother, let's say, etc. And he says explicitly, I kind of implied this, but let me make it clear. He says explicitly about this mother or any other equivalent situation to go to shul when you're supposed to be home, to be going to shul when you should be working. Instead of working, you're sneaking a mishnah to learn. If you shouldn't be doing that at the time, he refers to it as a mitzvah haba'ah avera. Right? You think you're doing a mitzvah, but really it's an avera. He said, we usually think of that in this context of work as, and he says as well, in the next paragraph, if I steal and then give tzedakah with that money, so that's not a mitzvah, that's a mitzvah of avera. Okay, that's obvious, but it's still important that he stated that obvious fact. This is not as obvious. And therefore, I think it's more important and instructive that we internalize what he says. If you should have been working, and instead you are davening or learning or doing some other mitzvah, you're not getting like a pat on the back from Yisrael Salanter or Rav Wolbe. You're wrong. That's, in a certain sense, a mitzvah b'avera, as he called it. Do your job. Now, it could be that you have hours in the day where the job is to daven, to learn, stages in your life. And of course, you should be doing that. And Rav Wolbe and Rav Shlomo Salanter would be as demanding on you as possible. But the key is not to turn those things, and again, I imagine this is like a meta theme of the whole series of your podcast. But the fact that when you were younger and learning and in kollel or in yeshiva, and that was the only responsibility you had, to think that that should still be the only goal you have when you're in a different stage of life is not just a recipe for frustration and psychological or emotional unhappiness. It's religiously wrong. Again, this is not the topic of this essay, or maybe not ever of your podcast, so not our topic, which is, well, how do I know when to leave yeshiva? And should I stay more in kollel, always in kollel? Okay, that's a different discussion. But we're discussing a person who's already working. And to think that the only way to have meaning in my life is if I learn is a misunderstanding of everything. And again, not only are you missing the opportunity, which is the first paragraph in the essay, to have meaning in every stitch, every tefirah, like Chanuch, but you are doing something even worse if you do the things that are parallel to the story in the essay, because you're in essence doing the mitzvah b'avera. So you've totally missed the point, to put it mildly. I'm sorry if that was a rant, but this is a part of the essay that gets me amped up.
Good. It was a rant and it was a good one, and I appreciate every word of it. And I want to take it even a step deeper. I definitely grew up Girsa Diankasa on Bill Belichick growing up in Boston in the early 2000s, and the "Do Your Job" mantra is certainly an important one and one that I take with me to this day. But I guess the challenge that I face in applying this is the fact that if you're at one of the 11 positions on the football team and your coach has given you a certain play to run, so the idea of "Do Your Job" is quite defined and specific and clear. For me, so I have 3 main jobs and I take them all very seriously. I'm a husband/father. I am a Bnei Torah who tries to learn and teach, and I am a professional. So those 3 jobs, just for starters, don't have clear boundaries. Sometimes they do, but oftentimes they don't, as to, how much of each and how to balance the 3 of them. So yes, my job is all 3 of those at the same time. And then it's a question of, feeling good about living my life, doing my job, but doing multiple jobs at the same time with, lines that blur between each other. And just to add on to that, maybe to take it one step further, is that when you gave the share, you opened up about, your own personal, call it struggles or challenges in this realm. So maybe if you want to try to address that, maybe through some of your own experiences, I'd be happy to learn from that as well.
So forgive the extended metaphor, but not to punt, now that we've gotten into the football team. But, take, for example, what you described. And, I think for most, if not everybody in your audience, including me, broadly speaking, right, I wear those 3 hats. Right? I have a job. Again, it's true that much of what I do, although not all of it at the moment, but much of what I do is Klei Kodesh. But still, I have a job, and I'm also trying to be an Eved Hashem on my own right. And then, of course, I'm a parent /father / a husband, family person. So how to figure out that balance, that's not the topic of this particular chapter. I'm not saying it's not that might be the most important thing you discuss repeatedly on this podcast, but he's not addressing that. And I would say my answer, which I think is a genuine answer, even though I know I'm also punting, is I don't think I couldn't give you a single answer. I don't think there's a formula for that. How much time should you spend? Well, a lot of that might depend on how much money do you need. Well, how do you define need? Where do I live? What are my expenses? I mean, there's so many variables that I at least for me, I can't speak for your other guests or the texts that you're studying on this podcast, but I couldn't give you an answer that would be a one-size-fits-all. Other than that, even though this may sound like a cliche, but I think it's a cliche because it's true, the struggle is the avodas Hashem. I'm not sure there's a single right answer, but I think the fact that you or anyone like you, or me, I hope, struggle over it and think about it, could be that in individual cases, people are miscalculating and need to, on their own or with the help of somebody, readjust. But for the most part, I'm not sure there's always a quote unquote right or wrong answer, as much as being aware that I have these multiple responsibilities. Even if we took out avodas Hashem, so now we're not in the Shtark Tank world, but just how do I be a good husband, good father, and a good professional? We could ask that question as religious Jews, or we could ask the question just as human beings. I don't know if there's a single answer to that question either. You add the whole avodas Hashem component, of course, we have a very complex cocktail of things. On a personal level, I don't remember honestly what I revealed. Part of my teaching and rabbiing is that I'm a sharer. Is that a real word? I'm not sure. But I don't hold back. I do share. Sometimes my family thinks I share too much. So I don't remember this, but I am a sharer. So I'm not surprised that you're reminding me that in that shir, in that pot, in that I gave, that I must have shared. So I don't remember exactly what I said there. But what I will say now, again, is, for most of my professional career, just until the last 4.5, 5 years, so I on the one hand, I had the same challenges. You can't be in 2 places at once. Am I in the office or am I at home? Now, it happens to be, for most of my professional life, the office was either a shul or a beis medrash. So, on the one hand, the guilt of I'm spending too much time at work is lessened because it's not, instead of being an Eved Hashem, I'm directly involved in something Melechas HaKodesh. On the other hand, it creates more vulnerability to perhaps not being a good enough family man, because I can so easily rationalize all the things I need to be doing at the shul or in the yeshiva, the beis medrash, etc. I still have that as very much part of my life, but as it happens, and this, it's gotten more complicated for me in the last 4.5 years, because I made a decision to leave the beis medrash, where I had been for 10 years altogether in the Gush, and am now full-time managing director of an organization called Tzalash, which helps religious soldiers. It's a very, very meaningful job. Again, I'm not in any way denigrating someone who is, quote, just in the high-tech world or in the Wall Street world or the business world. But in this case, I have the quote-unquote benefit that even the work that I do, which is not specifically teaching Torah, etc., but it's for an organization which is really meaningful and something that I really believe in, which is providing religious and emotional support to soldiers and their families. But all that notwithstanding, I made a decision, and it wasn't an easy one and it wasn't an obvious one, that of the waking hours of my day, a lot less of them are spent in a base medrash or in front of a sefer or teaching Torah. And now I'm in meetings, planning programs. I'm running an organization, managing a budget. I'm fundraising so that we have a budget, etc. And that was at the time not a simple decision for me, and it remains a challenge for me. I wouldn't say, I don't know if it's ironic, but perhaps specifically because I didn't have to figure this out at 25 or 26 or 27. And then by the time I'd be my age, I kind of got into a groove. I was in my late 40s before I made this switch, and I never had to learn, let's say, to take one example, like the skill of time management. Now, to be productive, you need time management in any field you're in. But when you talk about balancing avodas hakodesh and parnasa, I didn't have to learn that all the years that my parnasa and avodas hakodesh were synonymous. Now that they're not exclusively or entirely, I should say, synonymous, I'm finding that I have to learn on the job, if you will, that skill. And I can't say I'm always happy with or feel successful in my own balancing act.
So I appreciate the fact that you brought up Tzalash. It's a very important organization. I did want to actually focus on it in this conversation for a couple of reasons. Going back for a second to the the minyan and the family dynamic. So for me personally, certainly happens that I either come late to minyan or miss a minyan, or don't go to the minyan that I feel like I would daven best in because I am a father and because I'm struggling. And I also just wanted to appreciate and point out the interpretation of Lefum Tzara Agra as being relevant to these decisions and these struggles. I never thought of it that way, but I certainly am going to get a lot of schar if that is the pshat. But I will say that even if it's clear to me that it's the right decision because the family needs me to, be home at this hour. There's still a good bit of guilt in my mind about, not davening properly, not learning properly, even though the circumstances are clearly demanding that that's what I do at that time. So that psychology and that mindset is, I think, overlapping with Tzalash because, a lot of yeshiva guys who go to the army, they feel bad. They don't have a Yom Kippur davening like yeshiva. Again, on a certain level, I'm sure every one of them who made that decision understands it was the right decision to go out and protect the Jewish people in Gaza on Yom Kippur and not have a yeshiva Yom Kippur, going back to the religious high of that. But so the two things exist at the same time. They know in a certain part of their brain that what they're doing is the absolute right thing to do. And then they also feel in a certain part of their brain a lot of guilt about not having a certain religious standard. So I'm wondering if you could talk to that specific point, how you see it in Tzalash, how you see it in the Bnei Torah in the workforce, and if Rav Wolbe has insights or just Rav Gottlieb has insights, I'd love to hear them as well.
Yeah, I think it's, you bring up like really important and profound issues. I never had the schus of being a soldier myself. I made Aliyah at 35 and married with 4 kids. The army didn't want me, trust me. But, I thank God in addition to my work, I'm the father of multiple children who've already served and another one who's going to be, please God, joining the army Pesach time. So I've seen this very much up close, and I am, truly in awe of my children and many other soldiers who wrestle with this, struggle with this, like you say, the Lefum Tzara Agra. And I agree with that interpretation that you are referring to, that the very fact that they struggle with that, Magiya Lehem a lot of schar. The easiest thing and the most natural thing is not to struggle with it at all. And I want to go back on something that I said before when we were discussing the story of the woman in the shul and call Nidrei and do your job. I don't think in the cases that we're describing, and this is where the analogy and the football analogy would break down, I agree with you. In the cases that we're describing, I don't think that you have to necessarily give up on that struggle. I think there's a difference between feeling bad about yourself or shame or guilt. I think maybe if that was the word you used, I would definitely use that term. There's a difference between feeling guilt. Let's say it this way. I don't want this to be semantics, but there's a difference between feeling guilt and feeling bad. If the right thing, again, we're not here to discuss that what is the right thing to do. Maybe person X shouldn't be in the army. Maybe person Y shouldn't be in the workforce. We're not discussing that now, right? But if it's clear that it's the right thing to do, that now you're working, it's the right thing to do, now you're serving in the army defending the Jewish people. So if you're doing your job, then there should be no guilt. On the other hand, even when you know you're doing your job, if doing your job means you have to give up something, feeling bad that I missed out on something, I don't see why that's a problem. Again, I understand I'm not a robot. I understand there's a fine line between feeling guilty and feeling bad, and sometimes people could veer over the line. But if we're speaking now not as psychologists or just advice would have to be more personal. But if you want me to give just a shitat hachayim, if you will, I don't think you should feel guilty at all. But I think it's not inappropriate. On the contrary, it could be appropriate and healthy to feel bad. It doesn't even have to be just in the religious context. I mean, if sometimes, just take a simple parv example, right? A number of years ago, we had two nephews who had a bar mitzvah on the same Shabbos. One of my sisters, one of my son, and then my wife's sister's son. They lived in literally different countries, let alone different communities, right? We couldn't be at both. So we made what I think was the obvious decision. My wife went to the nephew who's the son of her sister, and I went to the bar mitzvah nephew with my sister. It was clearly the right thing to do. So I don't feel guilty about missing my nephew's bar mitzvah in Israel. And I don't think my wife felt guilty about missing my nephew's bar mitzvah in New York. But I felt bad because I wanted to be at both. I missed out on something that I would have wanted to be at. So I'll have to deal with the lowercase lamed, because I think that's a very nice example. But if you're talking about, I could have been in shul, but instead I'm on a shmirah. I could have been, again, I think of this, as much as I know this through Tzalash, I know this especially through my children who had these experiences. Like, it wasn't a question of what was the right thing to do. They knew the right thing to do, even if it was just on a quote unquote regular Shabbos. But I'm missing out on Shabbos.
Right. I just want to jump in because when we prepared this conversation, you told me some fantastic stories about your son Yaakov, someone who I have great love and respect and admiration for some of the things that he's done. So maybe choose one of those stories about this specific topic that you want to share with us, because I think those are such a
there's so many stories about him and my son, my other son Yosef, my son Naftali. But yes, Yaakov definitely has some incredible stories. I'm trying to think what would be, like you said, it's hard to pick one. He has a very close relationship that he developed even before he went into the army, and certainly throughout his army service, with the Gerer Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shalanter, as well as his younger brother, who's also a great Talmid Chacham, Rav Daniel Alter. And at various points in his army service, my son would have these experiences. There's a story which has become somewhat well known when he was, in his earlier years, where he was, driving around in a Jeep and doing shmirot, and he went to Rav Shalanter and he asked him, how can I be Makabel Shabbos when at the same moment I'm being Mechal Shabbos? And basically getting, chizuk from him and saying, you're not being Mechal Shabbos. You're thinking about this wrong. Like, my son wasn't really doubting what he should be doing or not. He knew what the right thing was, but he missed Shabbos. Or, there was a time where he was going to be I can't remember if it was Gaza or Lebanon or somewhere on Hanukkah, and he wasn't going to be able, you can't be in an ambushed or covert position, hidden position and lighting a Hanukkah candle. The Gerer Shiva told him, Tadlik Nyan b'neshama shalcha. There's other ways to experience Hanukkah. Or I remember my son was going in, I believe this is when he was going into Gaza, the second year of the war, and he was going to miss Shavuos. And again, he didn't doubt what he should be doing, but he was, or even before the war years ago, when he was in his earlier service, he was on the Gaza border for Rosh Yom Kippur. He barely had a minyan and etc. So to take him as an example, but again, it's not unique to him. I think if he felt guilty about it, then that's totally misplaced. But feeling bad about it is it's a sign, I think, of a very healthy neshama that loves and misses it. If you thought that Shabbos or Rosh Hashanah or Hanukkah is a burden, so you wouldn't miss it, right? You miss it and therefore feel bad about missing it because you love it. And I think that comes from a very healthy, place from a religious perspective. So whether it's the soldier and what they're missing out on, they don't get as much chance to learn, they don't get as much chance to. But so the answer is yes. If the goal is learning, or if the goal is so then yes, you can't, the spilled milk can't get put back in the bottle. But if the goal is, and here we get back to what we spoke about a few, 10, 15 minutes ago, if the goal is Ratzon Hashem, so this is what Hashem wants from you now. Now, again, so that's all I think that was a rant, I'm sorry. Maybe that was too long of an answer, but I think that's all my main answer to you is losing guilt and feeling bad. And I think bad, assuming you can manage it psychologically, is totally appropriate and very healthy. I'll just add a second answer, which is not in any way contradicting the first one, but by feeling bad, building on the first answer, that will also motivate you to the extent that it's possible to look for ways to be able to have a little bit of your cake and eat it too. That may not be possible, but maybe you can do more than you are doing. Maybe you can't, to use the army example, maybe there is a moment that you could steal here and there. Maybe if you did ask really earnestly, your mafaked would let you do X or Y. If you don't care at all and you don't feel bad at all, then you're not even going to push it. And I think all of us, and I'm certainly as guilty of this as anybody, right? We set our, expectations often way lower. We think we're capable of much less than we're really capable of. So what's going to push us to maximize what we're capable of? There could be a lot of things, but one of the things is, do I even feel bad that I'm not doing it? And if I do feel bad, not because I'm doing anything wrong, I don't feel guilty, I'm doing the right thing, but I miss davening, I miss having more time to learn, I miss whatever the case is. So then, again, I think it's a sign of a healthy neshama, but also might motivate me to push on the edges, on the border, to have a little bit more than maybe I right now do have.
It's so interesting because, I mean, I could be, I've heard this from other Rabbanim as well. And it could be, you also mentioned this in our conversation leading up to this episode, which is the fact that, in the example of, your son who's being makabel Shabbos while driving on a Jeep, the question really is like, is that chilul Shabbos? Like, should he feel it as chilul Shabbos? Should he feel that he misses being in a shul in Beit Shemesh or wherever he is in a Beis Medrash? Or no, the fact that he's driving now to protect Am Yisrael, Kiyum Shabbos or Kiyum Kol Torah Kula, Kiyum al Am Yisrael, Kiyum all the world by doing that. So I'm just trying to think through, like, is it really, like, it's a really tough balance to strike.
So I think here, obviously, there's a difference between what we're describing now and, staying an extra hour at the office, right? We're not talking about, but we're talking about, like an inherent mitzvah, like defending the Jewish people, et cetera, being in the army. One perhaps could be tempted to go down the rabbit hole in the whole discussion of hutra versus dechuya, and all those kind of things. But I don't think you have to. I'm not saying that. And I will tell you, not only orally and verbally, but if I remember correctly, I think it was Rav Shaul's younger brother, Rav Daniel. He wrote a letter, which is not, they're not embarrassed of it. In Ger world, in that world, it's a published letter. They know it. It doesn't have my son's name on it. They took it out, thankfully. And he would have preferred being anonymous. So I'm blowing his cover now. But the letter it's a famous letter now in the Ger. It was addressed to him by name from Rav Daniel Alter, where he made the point explicitly. It's a lo chilul Shabbat. This is the right thing to do. You're being matzil nefashos b'Yisrael. The right thing to do is to do this. That's Shmir Shabbos in your case. Atypical, but yes, for you it is. And I think the more we internalize that, the more meaning, just like I will say lahavdil between being an accountant or a computer programmer engineer and being on the front lines of Gaza or wherever to defend the Jewish people and risk your life. But just like we said before, by you bringing a certain level of intentionality, you can transform and uplift even being a cobbler or a shoemaker or any other profession. Certainly that's the case. If you realize, I'm not just in the army because I got stuck. I'm not just in the army because I happen to live in Israel and I'm 21 years old and I got drafted and my parents are the type of parents that made me go to this kind of yeshiva. You're still inherently doing a mitzvah by being in the army, no matter what your kavanah is. But if you actually have intentionality, wow, this is Ratzon Hashem, this is a mitzvah, wow, look what I'm doing. Formulating or processing what level of schar awaits such a soldier, it's above my pay grade. I can't even articulate it. That's how powerful and kadosh I think such a thing is.
Right. And I will just like to mention that
to repeat myself, and yet I think, at least theoretically, and I think even practically for many people, many soldiers, that could exist at the same time as feeling bad that you're not in the Beis Medrash, feeling bad that you're not in your shul or wherever you'd want to be for Shabbos.
Mm-hmm. I do think it is worth mentioning that we are recording this on January 26th, late at night. We did, we're all very, very overjoyed and grateful about the events of this afternoon, the final hostage, Ron Gvili, being returned home to Yisrael. So I do want to mention that. And it really is bizchus. I think every single person who put on a uniform and did the grunt work at every point of the war, at every point of the army, and everyone who picked up a tillim and picked up a sefer, an extra mitzvah, I'm sure every single effort was all contributed towards this wonderful moment that we had today. So I will just point that out and express that appreciation. Of course, Tov. This episode will be coming out in a couple of weeks, so I'm sure
you don't even realize.
Still be on a high.
You don't realize because you couldn't have. But I happen to know somebody. I'm close with somebody. I don't want to, for his own privacy, I guess I don't need to give away more details. But a soldier in Miluim who is a combat surgeon called me last week with the shaila. He had been in Miluim. He had just gotten home for an extended leave. And his mafaked called him and said, we have a mission coming up. At the time, the plan was to be on Shabbos. We need you to come back. And the question was, does he have to come back before Shabbos? So Mamela, he's already with his pluga, his unit, his gedud on Shabbos, or can he stay home, which from the army's perspective, they didn't mind until Saturday morning, and then drive on Shabbos to the Gaza border and then be brought into Gaza. Now, I'm familiar with the sugya. I wasn't comfortable, despite my familiarity with it, passing on my own. I actually went to Rav Asher Weiss to ask him the shaila, which I then conveyed to the chayal. As it turns, I'm not going to reveal the details of the psak. I don't think that's what's important. But I will tell you, I had a suspicion. I wasn't positive. I didn't say anything to him, but I had a suspicion. And today he confirmed. If you saw in the news, I think it's pretty public, which Miluim Gedud is the one that brought out Ron's body. That's the one that he's attached to.
Wow. So we'll leave it to our sleuths and the
So, but that was a shaila of Hilchos Shabbos. It wasn't about whether he should be part of the mission or not, but should he go back earlier before Shabbos, on Shabbos? That's a very interesting halakhic question. But certainly the act of those soldiers, again, and they didn't in the end maybe find him on Shabbos. I'm not even sure when they actually started looking from where he was, but at least at the time they thought it would have to be they were going to start on Shabbos. So no one was doubting that. My shaila was a little bit different, but it's just it hits very close to home, the scenario you're describing.
Right. So we're running very late on time. So I think just like to go over like the structure of this, short and golden essay from Rav Wolbe. He spoke about Chanuch and the attitude of being a giver and being chesed and yachid yichudim. Then he segued to talk about family and midos and that balance, which we spoke at a lot. He then goes on to talk about Yashras. We're going to maybe leave that for now, maybe for another podcast, just because we're short on time. But then finally, as you alluded to before, and I think we shouldn't wrap up this podcast before at least touching on it a little bit, is the question of Talmud Torah. So how does Rav Wolbe articulate the hashkafa and the hadracha around Talmud Torah for someone who's busy with their work, busy with their family? How should he be approaching this topic?
So I'll try to do something I'm not good at, which is be makatzer, but it is very, very powerful end of the essay, in which he basically has this very, very powerful line, in which he says to the people in the workforce, Hashem is not mityesh. Hashem has not given up on you, and you need to have aspirations to be a Talmid Chacham and to grow in your learning. Obviously, if you have limited time, and this is not what your profession is, you're going to not have as much time to learn, but that you should always be aspirational and feel an obligation to learn as much as you can. As I say, Rav Wolbe is not, despite he's giving you all this meaning about what you're doing in your work, in your professional life, he's not in any way forgiving you or releasing you from that aspiration. And he actually quotes a very powerful insight of Rav Chaim Mivolozhin in his commentary, Rav Chaim, that basically even in the line, which is famous in Chazal, Haneg behen derech eretz, that he is medayik from that it means even when you're doing your derech eretz, you're a computer programmer, you're an accountant, you're a lawyer, etc. It's all the other jobs, engineering, etc. You should still, even while you're doing behen, even when then, you should still be thinking about Talmud Torah. Now, he doesn't explicate it the way I'm about to say it, but I think he must mean it. And I want to introduce, just to finish up here, a language from an essay of Rav Soloveitchik, which is quoted in an English sefer called Divrei Harav. And that is, what Chaim Volozhiner and therefore Rav Wolbe must mean is not that you have, to use Rav Soloveitchik's terminology, acute awareness of the sugya and the daf yomi, whatever you're learning while you're doing your job. Let's take an extreme example. You're a surgeon, you're a doctor, you're a dentist, and someone is vulnerable in front of you. I don't think anyone would think that the ideal is that you should only have half your brain focused on, half your attention focused on the job and half of the focus on the daf yomi shir you went to earlier today. I think that would be obviously problematic. So what Soloveitchik says is that's what you and I call keeping in the front of our mind, or Soloveitchik called acute awareness. But rather, said Soloveitchik, what we have to have at all times is what he called latent awareness. And that is even when we're, yes, acutely what's on the front of our brain is the job that's in front of us. Every stitch, every tefirah. But if our relationship with Torah is so intertwined with who we are in our essence, existentially, who I am is, maybe it's only an hour of the day, maybe it's only half an hour a day, but that's maybe the highest, one of my most greatest pleasures. So then the Torah becomes a part of me, and then it never leaves me. Or Soloveitchik uses the analogy of a mother, right? Sometimes the mother is at the park watching her child. So then the child is on the acute awareness. But other times, especially as the kids get older, maybe the mom's at home and the child is in the park. The mom's at work, the child's at home. But said Rav Soloveitchik, and it's worth noting, he did not say this about fathers, but he did say this about mothers, that a child is always on the mind of the mother. So what do you mean? I'm not thinking about the child right now. I'm doing something else. So that's your acute awareness. But in the latent awareness, a mother is always thinking about her children. And said Rav Soloveitchik, when it comes to Torah, every Jew has to be a mother. We all have to have that latent awareness. And I think that is exactly what Rav Wolbe is saying at the end of this essay, that not only in the amount that you're learning, you should push yourself as much as you can, whatever that is. But second of all, even when you're not learning, your relationship to Torah should be such, like a mother and her children, where it's always a part of you and you're bringing it with you wherever you are, whatever you do for a living.
Amazing. So we're going to go to the lightning round in one more minute, but before we do that, I do wanted to ask you, for those who are listening to especially the parts of this conversation about Tzalash, about Bnei Torah in the army and the struggles that they are going through. And I don't want to call it struggles, the tensions that they deal with and the services Tzalash is providing for them. Maybe just a quick word on how people can learn more about Tzalash, how they can get involved in Tzalash, what type of things are needed. I'm sure donations are always needed. If there are other things that you would want to plug while we're on the podcast right now, we'd love to hear.
I appreciate the offer. I don't want to take too much advantage of it, but since you have invited me to do so, it is a very, very wonderful organization. We're actually in our bar mitzvah year, our 13th year, and it's a zchus for me to hear that people like you and your friends and other people like you, your brother-in-law, Shalom, and others, Hashem Yom Tov, who were in the army, Bnei Torah from all the yeshivas have benefited from our work, and it is a very, very meaningful work for those who are interested in learning more. Tzalash.org, TZA-LA.org. That's tzalash.org. You can learn about it. And yes, as Yaakov has clearly encouraged you to do, you can also donate via the website.
Yeah, no commissions coming to Shtark Tank, but I think it's very much worthwhile. So let's go to our lightning round. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're in the winter. We have these nice long Friday nights. What does Rabbi Gottlieb like to do with that time?
So I like to spend time with my family. And because I am a rabbi and I have a lot of teaching and stuff to do on Shabbos, so I have to admit, I don't necessarily spend till late hours learning, but I do like to get a good night's sleep.
Okay, wonderful.
I admit it.
And I'm sure that you're teaching a lot and learning a lot, but currently what's on your desk as your go-to Parsha Sefer for Parsha Shavua?
Go-to Parsha Sefer. You didn't prepare me for this. It's not my go-to Parsha Sefer. I'll answer the question you didn't ask. But my current, recent love of a sefer that I maybe didn't appreciate when I was younger is the Chasam Sofer al Torah. The Chasam Sofer is most well known as a posek, lesser known perhaps as a commentary on the Gemara. But I think he's totally underappreciated as a commentary on the Torah. I think his commentary on the Torah is incredible.
Okay, wonderful. And finally, if you were forced to quit your job as a rabbi, your important holy work in Tzalash, find some new job, some new industry, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
Yaakov, these are hard. What would I do if I wasn't doing what I'm doing now? The only thing I ever really seriously considered besides this, which was not even that serious, was business. So I would say perhaps business, or something that I love in my rabbinate, which is trying to talk to people and I doing my best to help them. So maybe it would have been to go into some form of the field of mental health or therapy.
Okay, our listeners should know that Rabbi Gottlieb is so committed that we're talking very late at night. He's had a full day doing all of his work, and then in the evening there were people wanting to speak to him along those lines. So Rabbi Gottlieb, thank you so much for carving out the generous time to share all these beautiful ideas with us and our listeners, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Yaakov, and keep up all your holy work. Only Michael.
Thank you so much. Thank you.